Chapter 1. Before Hawaii was Hawaii. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of what seems like endless blue water, a fire began to stir beneath the waves. The earth shifted, molten rock pushed upward from deep inside the planet, and mountains of lava slowly climbed toward the surface. For millions of years, this restless force kept pushing, bubbling, breaking the ocean's skin with violent bursts of fire and ash. What emerged was not one island, but a chain of islands, each born in sequence as the Pacific tectonic plate drifted slowly over a stationary hotspot. In this way, Hawaii was created, not in an instant, not in a century, but through eons of ceaseless volcanic labor. The islands stood as black ridges against the ocean, steaming, barren, without trees, without birds, without people. They were raw earth, carved by molten rivers, shaped by eruptions, cooled by rain, and battered by waves. At first, the land was silent. There were no voices, no footsteps, only the hiss of lava and the crash of waves. But nature, relentless in its patience, began its slow work. Seeds carried by wind from far-off continents landed on these rocky shores. Some clung to life, sprouting into ferns and grasses that rooted themselves in cracks of cooled lava. Birds came next, blown off course by storms, their feathers heavy with seeds. Insects followed, creeping, buzzing, building small kingdoms in this new world. Over time, forests spread, valleys filled with trees, waterfalls cut their way through basalt cliffs, and beaches of white sand appeared along the shorelines. From the chaos of volcanic fire came a fragile, living paradise. The Hawaiian Islands were young compared to much of the world, but they were already rich with life, a jewel chain scattered across the sea. For thousands of years, no human eye had ever seen them. No voice had echoed in the valleys. No hand had planted a taro root or lifted a fishing net. The islands existed, waiting. But to the south and west, in a vast region of the Pacific Ocean, a people of extraordinary skill were mastering the seas. Long before the first Europeans thought to build ships strong enough to cross oceans, the Polynesians had already done so. From Samoa, Tonga, and the Marquesas, they set out in great double-hulled canoes, vessels strong enough to carry families, livestock, water, and food across thousands of miles of open water. Their navigation was an art, a science passed down from memory, not books. They read the stars like a map, watched the flight paths of birds, felt the swells of the ocean against the hulls of their canoes, and even smelled the faint scent of land carried on the wind. With these skills, they voyaged farther than any other people on Earth at the time, settling islands scattered across a third of the planet's surface. It was into this empty expanse that a group of explorers one day pushed their canoes northward, into waters unknown. No one knows precisely when the first Polynesians arrived in Hawaii, but archaeologists suggest around 1,500 years ago, perhaps earlier. Imagine the courage of those first voyagers. They launched into the vast Pacific without any guarantee that land lay ahead. Behind them was the memory of home. Ahead, only the promise of possibility. Days turned into weeks. The sun burned by day, the stars glittered by night, and still the horizon was endless. On deck, families huddled together, children clung to their parents, and the priests whispered prayers to the gods of the sea. The canoes creaked with the weight of their cargo. Pigs, chickens, dogs, taro roots, breadfruit seedlings, and gourds filled with fresh water. This was not a simple journey of curiosity. It was a leap into the unknown, a gamble with survival at stake. And then, one morning, the watchman cried out, A thin smudge of green rose from the ocean, framed against the horizon. At first it seemed a dream, but as the hours passed, the smudge grew into mountains draped in mist, their ridges sharp like the backs of sleeping dragons. Waterfalls spilled down their sides. Birds circled overhead. The smell of life, flowers, earth, wet leaves, drifted across the water. They had found a new world. After weeks of nothing but waves, the Hawaiian Islands loomed before them, untouched, waiting. When their canoes scraped onto the black sand beaches, the voyagers stepped ashore with awe. Everything was strange. The plants were unfamiliar, the animals cautious, the mountains vast and imposing. But there was also abundance. Fresh water tumbling from cliffs, fertile valleys rich with volcanic soil, and seas alive with fish. Here was a place where life could not only survive, but flourish. They began to build shelters, to plant the taro and breadfruit they had carried with them, and to release their pigs and chickens onto the land. They lit fires, sang chants, and gave thanks to the gods who had guided them safely across the ocean. For the Hawaiians who would come after, this story was more than history. It was legend, woven into chants and songs, carried from one generation to the next. They spoke of heroic navigators guided by the goddess Hina or by the demigod Maui, the trickster who once tried to pull islands from the depths of the sea with his magical hook. Myth and memory blended into a single truth: that their ancestors had conquered the ocean and found a paradise at the world's edge. In those early years, life was simple but demanding. Families settled along the coasts where the sea provided fish and the valleys gave fertile ground. They carved canoes from koa trees, lashed them with rope from coconut fiber, and paddled out into the deep blue to fish for tuna and mahi-mahi. They built fish ponds along the shorelines, engineering marvels that trapped fish as the tides came and went, ensuring a steady food supply. Taro patches spread across the valleys, flooded with water diverted from mountain streams. Over time, the people grew numerous. Villages rose, chiefs claimed authority, and the foundations of Hawaiian culture began to take shape. But those developments belong to later chapters. For now, in the beginning, it was enough to marvel at the miracle of arrival. The union of land and people, of fire-born islands and star-guided voyagers. The islands themselves continued their restless growth. Mauna Loa, the largest volcano on Earth, rose higher with every eruption, towering above the clouds. Kilauea spilled rivers of lava into the sea, creating new land even as it destroyed forests. To the north, the older islands, once volcanic giants, began to erode, their peaks softened by wind and rain. Time shaped them into valleys, cliffs, and beaches of breathtaking beauty. Each island had its own character, its own spirit. The newcomers gave them names, sang chants to honor them, and told stories that explained their birth. They saw in the fire and smoke the work of Pele, goddess of the volcano, fierce and unpredictable, creator and destroyer. For Hawaiians, the land was not just geography. It was alive, sacred, and filled with divine presence. As the years passed, the first settlers became many. Generations were born who knew no other home but Hawaii. The memory of the voyage remained, but it turned into legend, a tale of distant ancestors who had braved the impossible. The islands shaped them as much as they shaped the islands. The mountains provided wood, the valleys gave food, and the sea bound everything together. In this delicate balance, a new people emerged, Hawaiian, distinct from their Polynesian cousins, yet forever linked by blood and memory. The story of Hawaii begins then, not with a single event, but with two miracles: the birth of the islands themselves from fire and sea, and the arrival of the first people who found them, guided by stars and courage. Without the volcanoes, there would have been no land. Without the voyagers, there would have been no voices to tell the story. Together, land and people created the foundation for everything that would follow: the rise of chiefs and kingdoms, the coming of foreigners, the struggles, the triumphs, and the enduring spirit of Aloha. But that is for later. For now, picture those first moments: the glow of lava against the night sky, the creak of canoes across a moonlit ocean, and the joy of landfall after weeks of endless sea. Hawaii was born, and its story had just begun. Chapter 2: Gods, Chiefs, and Legends. When the first canoes landed, and the new settlers looked upon the towering mountains and fire-lit skies of their new home, they knew immediately that this was not an ordinary place. The earth here was alive in a way unlike anywhere else. At night, the peaks glowed red as rivers of molten stone carved their way down to the sea. Ash and smoke painted the sky with strange colors. Thunder seemed to roll from the ground itself, and forests could vanish overnight under walls of lava. For these people, who had crossed an ocean guided by the stars, the only explanation for such awesome forces was that the islands were ruled by gods, ancient, powerful, and never to be ignored. Out of this reverence was born a mythology that was as rich as the land itself. Stories that explained the power they witnessed, legends that would guide their lives, and a sacred order that bound every man, woman, and child. Foremost among these deities was Pele, the goddess of fire and volcanoes, the fierce creator whose very breath seemed to live within the craters. Pele was not gentle. She was a goddess of passion and destruction, but also of birth and renewal. Her temper could erase villages in a single night. Yet the same lava that consumed the forests hardened into fertile soil, giving new life to taro fields and forests. The people feared her wrath, but also depended on her generosity. For without her constant work, there would have been no islands to call home. They told of how she had journeyed across the Pacific, fleeing conflict with her sister, the sea goddess, until at last she made her home in Kilauea, one of the great volcanoes of Hawaii Island. There she remained, sleeping and waking, creating and destroying, her presence always felt in the trembling of the earth and the fiery glow from the mountains. Even today, Hawaiians say that Pele still walks the land, sometimes as a beautiful young woman with flowing hair, sometimes as an old woman asking for food. To refuse her kindness was dangerous, for her vengeance was swift, but to show respect was to win her blessing. If Pele represented the raw power of the land, Maui, the trickster demigod, embodied the daring spirit of the people who had first crossed the ocean. His stories were not only tales of mischief, but lessons of ingenuity and courage. It was Maui, they said, who slowed the sun by lassoing it with his rope, giving humans more hours of daylight to work their fields. It was Maui who fished up islands from the sea with his magical hook, tugging at the ocean floor until land rose to the surface. His deeds were grand, but he was also flawed, a figure who bent the rules, who sometimes paid for his boldness with failure. To hear the stories of Maui was to learn that greatness often came with risk, and that those who dared could shape the world. For a people who had dared to set sail across thousands of miles of open ocean, Maui was not just a myth. He was a reflection of themselves, proof that audacity could triumph over fear. These gods and heroes filled every valley and every breeze with meaning. A sudden gust of wind was not just weather, but the breath of a spirit. A stone with an unusual shape might be a body transformed by the gods. Waterfalls were sacred places, caves were portals, and chants carried the voices of the divine. Life was lived in constant dialogue with the unseen, and this belief was woven into the very structure of society. The kapu system, sacred law, governed every aspect of daily life, ensuring that balance was maintained between the people, the land, and the gods. Kapu dictated what could be eaten, where one could walk, when certain activities could be done, and how men and women interacted. To break kapu was not merely to break a law, it was to offend the gods themselves, an offense punishable sometimes by death. Yet kapu was not only about restriction, it was about harmony. It protected the resources of the islands, ensuring that fish were harvested only in their season, that forests were preserved, and that the fragile balance of life in a remote land was not broken. At the heart of this sacred order stood the alii, the chiefs. They were not rulers in the way that kings of Europe were rulers, distant and crowned in palaces. The alii were believed to be descended from the gods themselves, their bloodlines carrying divine power known as mana. This mana was not symbolic, it was real, palpable, and visible in their authority, their rituals, and the prosperity of their people. To disobey a chief was to risk not only political punishment, but spiritual disaster. The alii carried the responsibility of maintaining kapu, of ensuring that the gods were honored with offerings, and of protecting the people by keeping harmony between the earthly and divine. Their power was immense, but it was also bound by duty. An alii who failed to show generosity, who allowed famine or disrespect for tradition, risked losing his mana and, with it, his legitimacy. This order created a society that was both complex and deeply spiritual. Priests, or kahuna, advised the alii, interpreting signs from the gods, chanting prayers, and overseeing rituals. Farmers worked the taro fields with respect, knowing the land was not theirs to own, but theirs to steward. Fishermen offered the first catch of the season to the sea, thanking Aloha, the god of the ocean, for his gifts. Even ordinary people lived with constant awareness of the sacred, knowing that each action, where they stepped, what they touched, what they ate, was part of a larger balance. A breach of kapu could be deadly, but it could also be cleansed through ritual, restoring harmony. The system was strict, but it gave order, stability, and meaning in a world where survival depended on respecting the land and the gods that animated it. And yet, within these structures, there was beauty. Festivals marked the passing of seasons. Hula told stories of gods and heroes through movement and chant, and mele, songs, carried history from one generation to the next. The Hawaiian world was not one of fear alone. It was one of reverence and celebration, where every feast, every chant, every ritual connected the living to the eternal. The alii might stand above, but the people were not powerless. In their chants, in their dances, in their stories, they preserved identity and memory, ensuring that even as generations passed, the connection to the gods remained unbroken. Imagine a night in those early centuries. A village gathers on the shore under a sky glittering with stars. The air is filled with the sound of drums, the chants of priests, the flicker of firelight casting shadows on dancers whose movements tell of Maui's daring or Pele's fury. Children watch wide-eyed, absorbing lessons wrapped in story. Elders nod, reminded of voyages long past and laws that must never be broken. The alii sits at the center, the embodiment of divine order, while the sea laps gently at the shore, a reminder that even here, at the edge of the world, the gods are near. In that moment, myth and life are one, history and legend indistinguishable. This was the world that the first centuries in Hawaii created, a society bound by sacred law, ruled by chiefs whose authority came from the gods, and enriched by legends that gave shape to the mysteries of life. The mountains, the seas, the stars, all had voices, all carried meaning. To live in Hawaii was to live within a story, one that began with creation and stretched endlessly forward, always reminding its people that they were not separate from the divine, but woven into its very fabric. It was a world both fragile and powerful, balanced between the fury of Pele's lava and the trickery of Maui's rope, between the strict demands of Kapu and the living presence of Mane. It was a world unlike any other, and it was here, in these beliefs, that the seeds of Hawaiian identity were planted. And as generations passed, those seeds would grow into kingdoms, alliances, and struggles that would shape the islands forever. But in the beginning, before conquest, before strangers, it was the gods, the chiefs, and the sacred laws that defined what it meant to be Hawaiian. Chapter 3: A Chain of Kingdoms. Out of the myths and sacred laws grew not only a people but a society that was vibrant, ordered, and alive with culture. By the centuries before Europeans ever arrived, Hawaii had become a thriving world in its own right. A civilization that was both deeply spiritual and astonishingly practical. The land and the gods had provided abundance, but it was human skill and careful stewardship that turned the raw earth of the islands into a place where tens of thousands of people could flourish. From the taro patches in the valleys to the great fish ponds on the coast, from the chants of priests to the sway of dancers, life before contact was neither primitive nor static. It was dynamic, sophisticated, and bound by the rhythms of the land and the sea. The backbone of this life was agriculture. Hawaiians had transformed their volcanic home into a vast, intricate garden. Streams that tumbled down the mountains were diverted into elaborate irrigation systems, feeding terraces of loikalo, taro fields that carpeted the valleys in green. Taro was more than food, it was kin. According to tradition, it was the elder brother of humankind, a sacred plant that symbolized the connection between people and the earth. Families tended the fields with reverence, planting and harvesting in harmony with the cycles of the moon. The work was grueling, feet sunk in wet soil as they tended the broad leaves, but the reward was sustenance that fed entire communities. Alongside taro grew sweet potatoes, yams, breadfruit, bananas, and sugarcane, each carefully cultivated, each part of a system that ensured survival in these remote islands. But the genius of the Hawaiians lay not only in farming the land, but in mastering the sea. Along the coasts, they built great fish ponds, engineering marvels that harnessed the tides to provide a steady supply of food. Walls of stone and coral were constructed to enclose sections of ocean, designed with clever sluice gates that allowed small fish to swim in, but trapped them as they grew larger. In this way, the ocean became a living pantry, always stocked, always replenished. The fish ponds fed thousands, a symbol of both ingenuity and sustainability, proof that human hands could work with nature rather than against it. Combined with fishing expeditions on outrigger canoes, nets cast into the waves, and hooks carved from bone and shell, the bounty of the sea ensured that few ever went hungry. This abundance gave rise to a flourishing culture. With food secured, people could turn their energy toward art, ritual, and tradition. Storytelling became the lifeblood of memory, for there was no writing in old Hawaii. Instead, knowledge was carried in chants, in songs, in the careful recitation of genealogies that linked the living to ancestors stretching back centuries. Every child grew up listening to the voices of elders who, by the flicker of firelight, recounted tales of gods, of Maui's daring feats, of Pele's fiery temper, of chiefs who had ruled wisely or foolishly. These stories were not idle entertainment. They were the archive of the people, their library spoken aloud, ensuring that nothing important was forgotten. To forget a story was to sever a link in the chain of history, so memory was a sacred duty. And when words were not enough, there was a dance. The hula, born from ritual and myth, was a way of embodying story and movement. Every sway of the hips, every gesture of the hands, every beat of the drum carried meaning. Through hula, the exploits of gods and heroes were brought to life before the community. It was prayer, performance, and teaching all at once. The rhythm of drums echoed the heartbeat of the land. The chanting of voices wove myth and history into the air. And the dancers became living texts, their bodies inscribed with memory. To witness hula was to witness the spirit of the people moving before you. It was an act of devotion, a way of binding community together, a declaration that their stories would not die. This richness of culture and abundance of food did not erase the realities of power. The islands were not united, but divided into separate chiefdoms, each ruled by its own alii, each claiming descent from the gods, as each striving to protect and expand its mana. The alii lived in compounds near the shore, surrounded by attendants, warriors, and priests, their status marked by cloaks of bright feathers and helmets that gleamed in the sun. Around them stretched the villages of common people, farmers and fishermen who worked the land and sea, bound by kapu to respect the sacred order. The ali'i's word carried weight not simply because of force, but because it was believed that their very presence carried divine authority. To approach them carelessly was forbidden. To disobey them was to risk not only punishment, but spiritual disaster. Yet, for all their authority, no single ali'i ruled the islands as a whole. Instead, Hawaii was a chain of kingdoms, sometimes allied, sometimes at war. Rival chiefs vied for power, launching canoes filled with warriors across channels to raid neighboring islands, seizing resources, captives, and prestige. Battles were fought on beaches, spears clashing, clubs swinging, warriors chanting war cries as they surged into combat. The outcome of these conflicts determined which chief rose in power, which family gained greater mana, and which people were forced into submission. But war was not constant. Just as often, alliances were forged through marriage, diplomacy, and the careful exchange of gifts. The balance of power shifted like the tides, each ali'i seeking to expand influence while maintaining the fragile harmony of the islands. For ordinary people, life continued regardless of the ambitions of chiefs. In the mornings, families tended the taro patches, men casting nets into the sea while women prepared food and wove mats. Children learned by watching, their small hands imitating the motions of their parents, their ears filled with chants and stories. Religion was everywhere. A fisherman might whisper a prayer to Aloha before casting his line. A farmer might offer the first taro of the harvest to Lono, god of fertility and peace. Temples of stone, called heiau, dotted the landscape, places where offerings were laid, chants were sung, and the gods were petitioned. In times of war, sacrifices might be made to Ku, the god of war, to ensure victory. In times of famine, priests might plead with Lono for rain. The spiritual and the practical were never separate. They were one, woven together in the daily life of the people. And though Kapu was strict, life had its joys. Feasts were held when the harvest was good, when victories were won, or when the gods demanded celebration. Families gathered, food piled high, roasted pig, fresh fish, sweet poi from the taro fields, fruit plucked from trees. Drums echoed, dancers swayed, and laughter filled the air. These moments of abundance were not mere indulgence. They were affirmations of community, reminders that in a world governed by gods and chiefs, the people themselves still had space to celebrate life. In these gatherings, the bonds of family and friendship were renewed, and the sense of belonging that bound Hawaiians together grew stronger. Over the generations, each island developed its own identity, shaped by geography, by chiefs, and by tradition. Hawaii Island, the largest, was a land of powerful chiefs and fierce warriors, its vast volcanoes towering above all others. Maui was proud, fertile, and rich, its chiefs often seeking to challenge their rivals across the channels. Oahu, with its sheltered valleys and harbors, became a center of prosperity. Kauai, far to the west, maintained its independence fiercely, its chiefs resisting domination from outsiders. Each island was part of a chain, yet each was distinct, proud of its own heritage, proud of its own alii. Together, they formed a world of diversity and rivalry, a world that was at once united by culture and divided by ambition. This was Hawaii before the world beyond knew it, a place where the land itself was sacred, where every mountain and stream carried the presence of gods, where society was bound by kapu and illuminated by hula, where chiefs ruled by divine right and ordinary people lived in harmony with the cycles of nature. It was a civilization isolated yet complete, fragile yet enduring, sustained by ingenuity and faith. From the outside, it might have seemed a paradise untouched by time, but within, it was a living, breathing world, as complex and dynamic as any kingdom across the oceans. And though the people did not yet know it, their islands would not remain hidden forever. The sails of strangers were already approaching across the horizon, drawn by the same seas their ancestors had once crossed. But for now, in the centuries before contact, Hawaii was its own universe, a chain of kingdoms alive with stories, bound by sacred order, and thriving at the edge of the world. Chapter 4. The Strangers Arrive. For centuries, the Hawaiian Islands had lived in their own rhythm, ruled by chiefs, guided by gods, sustained by the abundance of earth and sea. Generations had risen and passed away beneath the shadow of mountains and the glow of lava. The people knew nothing of the vast world beyond their horizon, just as that distant world knew nothing of them. But in the late 18th century, sails appeared on the horizon, tall white wings unlike anything the Hawaiians had ever seen. The world of isolation was about to end, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first of the strangers to set foot upon their shores was a man whose name would be etched forever into Hawaiian memory, Captain James Cook. It was the year 1778 when Cook's ships, HMS Resolution and HMS Discovery, entered Hawaiian waters. For the Hawaiians, who watched from the shore, the sight was both wondrous and bewildering. Great wooden islands seemed to float across the sea, their towering masts clothed in white cloth that caught the wind and drove them forward with a speed no canoe could match. Figures moved upon their decks, men with pale skin, bearded faces, and clothing unlike anything the islanders had known. To some, these strangers seemed almost like gods descended from the heavens. To others, they were spirits or messengers of the divine. The Hawaiians had no word for ships like these, so they named them with what they knew. Great canoes. The first encounters were cautious, filled with curiosity on both sides. The Hawaiians paddled out in their canoes to greet the ships, offering food, chanting, and watching closely. The Europeans, armed with iron tools, muskets, and knowledge of the wider world, studied these islanders with equal fascination. Cook himself had been searching for new lands and a route across the Pacific, part of a grand mission of exploration. When he arrived in Hawaii, it was almost by accident. But it was an accident that would alter history. He and his men were greeted with generosity. Bananas, coconuts, and pigs were exchanged for nails, beads, and bits of iron. The Hawaiians, who had never before seen metal forged in such abundance, prized these objects as treasures, tools that could cut wood more swiftly than stone or bone. The first sparks of trade were lit, and with them, the first threads of change began to weave into Hawaiian life. For the Hawaiians, contact with these newcomers was not only about objects, but about meaning. The timing of Cook's arrival coincided with the festival of Makahiki, a season dedicated to Lono, the god of peace and fertility. During this time, warfare was suspended, offerings were made, and the people celebrated abundance. Some Hawaiians looked upon Cook, with his tall ships and foreign ways, and believed he might be an incarnation of Lono himself, returning from across the sea as the chants foretold. Whether Cook understood this or not is uncertain, but his presence was met with reverence, his ships welcomed into the harbors, his men treated with respect and awe. For weeks, they were guests of honor, their every need supplied by the generosity of the people, who marveled at their strange tools, their firearms, and their seemingly godlike power. But even as gifts were exchanged and friendships formed, shadows lingered. The sailors brought with them more than metal and cloth. Hidden in their bodies were invisible enemies, diseases against which the Hawaiians had no defense. Smallpox, measles, venereal diseases, influenza. Each would, in time, sweep through the islands like fire, leaving devastation in its wake. In 1778, the full force of these plagues had not yet struck, but the seeds had been planted. The first fevers spread quietly, and though few realized it, Hawaii's population had begun a slow decline that would, within a century, reduce it by staggering numbers. What came wrapped as gifts of contact also carried the weight of tragedy. Still, in those early months, hope seemed stronger than fear. The Hawaiians offered Cook sacred places to anchor his ships, led him to Heiau, where he observed their rituals, and filled his stores with provisions for his onward journey. In return, Cook demonstrated European power. His ships fired their cannons in display, booming thunder that shook the air and startled the islanders. Muskets flashed, iron tools gleamed, and charts were drawn. To the Hawaiians, these strangers carried a mana of their own, a force not from their gods, but from some other source beyond comprehension. To Cook, the Hawaiians were yet another discovery, another page in the expanding map of the Pacific, a people to be described in his journals, their customs and appearance carefully noted. After his initial departure, Cook returned once more to Hawaii in 1779, seeking safe harbor during his voyage. He anchored in Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii, and there his reception was even more elaborate. The bay was sacred to Lono, and once again, some Hawaiians saw his arrival as fulfillment of prophecy. Cook and his men were welcomed with chants, with offerings, with rituals that blurred the line between hospitality and worship. His sailors enjoyed feasts, his ships were resupplied, and for a time, the relationship between the two worlds seemed one of harmony. But harmony in Hawaii was always delicate, maintained by kapu, by balance, by respect for the gods. And soon, that balance began to crack. The longer Cook remained, the more tensions grew. The generosity of the Hawaiians was immense, but their resources were not endless. The demands of the sailors, their unfamiliar ways, their occasional disrespect of kapu, began to strain patience. Fights broke out, thefts occurred, and the illusion of divinity that had surrounded Cook started to fade. If he had been Lono, some now began to question why he behaved like an ordinary man, why he allowed his sailors to quarrel, why he took without always giving back. Reverence turned into suspicion, awe into doubt. The fragile thread of trust was fraying. Then came the fateful moment. After weeks in the bay, Cook prepared to depart. His ship sailed out, but a storm damaged one of his masts, forcing him to return. This second arrival, so soon after his grand departure, was unsettling to the Hawaiians. If he were truly a god, why would his canoe break? Why would he return, needy and dependent? For many, the illusion was shattered. Cook was no longer a divine figure, but a man, fallible and perhaps dangerous. Tensions boiled over. Disputes flared into violence, and in the confusion, Cook attempted to seize the Hawaiian king, Kalaniʻopuʻu, hoping to hold him hostage to force the return of a stolen boat. To the Hawaiians, this was an unforgivable act, a violation of the sacred order, an assault upon the very embodiment of divine mana. The beach at Kealakekua erupted into chaos. Warriors surged forward, armed with spears and clubs, their chants filled with rage. Cook, surrounded, tried to retreat toward the water, but there was no escape. In the struggle, he was struck down, killed by the very people who had once welcomed him as a god. His body was taken, not desecrated, but treated with the rituals given to chiefs, his bones preserved with honor, even as his death marked the violent end of his presence in Hawaii. His sailors, shocked and overwhelmed, retreated to their ships, firing their cannons in fury, killing dozens on the shore. What had begun in wonder and exchange ended in blood and fire. The death of Cook at Kealakekua Bay was more than the end of a man. It was the symbolic end of Hawaii's isolation. The islands could never again return to the world they had known before. Though Cook's ships sailed away, others would follow. Traders, explorers, missionaries, and settlers would arrive in his wake, each bringing change, each leaving a mark. But in 1779, all of that still lay in the future. For the Hawaiians who had fought on the beach, it was a day of defense, of protecting their king, their gods, their kapu. For the sailors who mourned their captain, it was a shocking defeat, a reminder that even in the far reaches of the Pacific, European power was not absolute. Two worlds had collided, and the collision had been fatal. Yet in the quiet that followed, the land endured. The waves still broke upon the shore, the volcanoes still smoked against the sky, the chants still rose in the night. Hawaii remained itself, but its story had forever shifted. The strangers had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The islands that had thrived in isolation were now bound to the wider world, a chain of kingdoms that would face storms far greater than any erupting volcano. But for now, the memory of Cook lingered like a scar, a story told in whispers by the fire. The tale of the white-skinned stranger who came as a god, stayed as a guest, and died as a man. Chapter 5. Kamehameha the Great, conqueror of the islands. The death of Captain James Cook did not close Hawaii off from the outside world. On the contrary, it opened a new chapter. In the years that followed, more ships came, traders and sailors eager to resupply, to barter, to explore the strange and fertile islands in the middle of the Pacific. With them came new tools, new weapons, and new ideas. Iron knives, muskets, and cannons found their way into Hawaiian hands. Some alii saw in these foreign gifts nothing more than curiosities. Others saw power. And among them was one man who would change the destiny of the islands forever. His name was Kamehameha. Born on the island of Hawaii in the mid-18th century, Kamehameha's birth was surrounded by omens. Stories tell of a comet streaking across the night sky, a fiery sign interpreted by Kahuna as a prophecy that a great chief would rise, one who would unite all the islands under his rule. To protect the child from rivals, his family kept him hidden for a time. But destiny could not be concealed. As he grew, so did his reputation. Tall, broad-shouldered, and fierce in battle, Kamehameha was trained in the arts of war and the rituals of kapu. He was a warrior of extraordinary strength, but also a man of sharp mind, watching and learning, never forgetting the prophecy that hung over his life. Hawaii in those years was a land of rival chiefs, each island ruled by its own alii, each jealously guarding power. Alliances rose and fell like the tides. Battles erupted across the valleys and along beaches. Canoes clashed in the channels, warriors hurled spears and swung clubs. And the outcome of each fight could shift the balance of power. Into this fractured world, Kamehameha emerged as both a warrior and a strategist. He understood that brute strength alone would not be enough to fulfill his destiny. He needed more weapons, more allies, more knowledge. And the strangers from across the seas provided exactly that. Foreign traders quickly learned that Hawaii was not simply a rest stop in the Pacific. It was a land where chiefs competed for dominance, and where muskets and cannons could tip the scales of war. They brought firearms in exchange for provisions, sandalwood, and labor. They brought iron, which could be fashioned into tools and weapons far stronger than stone. They even brought advisors, men who found in Kamehameha not only a patron, but a leader with vision. Among them was John Young, an English sailor stranded in Hawaii, and Isaac Davis, a Welshman who survived a bloody clash and became one of Kamehameha's most trusted allies. These men trained Kamehameha's warriors in the use of muskets and cannons, teaching them tactics unknown to traditional Hawaiian combat. Under their guidance, the king-to-be forged an army unlike any other in the islands. Kamehameha was not the only chief to gain access to Western weapons, but he wielded them with unmatched discipline. He gathered warriors from across Hawaii Island, building loyalty through both generosity and fear. His rule was strict, his enforcement of kapu severe, but his vision inspired loyalty. He made alliances through marriage, binding powerful families to his cause. And above all, he was relentless. With each victory, his mana grew. His rivals feared him, and his followers revered him. He was not merely a chief. He was becoming the embodiment of prophecy. The pivotal test came in 1795, when Kamehameha turned his sights upon Oahu. He had already subdued much of Hawaii Island, Maui, and Molokai, leaving Oahu as the strongest rival standing in his path. With a fleet of canoes and Western-rigged ships, armed with cannons and muskets, his forces crossed the channel. The battle that followed would become legendary. on the slopes of Nuuanu, overlooking the fertile valleys of Oahu, Kamehameha's army clashed with the defenders. Spears and muskets thundered, the smoke of cannon fire mixed with the cries of warriors. Step by step, Kamehameha's forces drove their enemies back, higher and higher into the cliffs. Trapped on the edge, with nowhere to flee, hundreds of Oahu warriors were forced over the precipice of Nuuanu, their bodies crashing onto the rocks below. The slaughter was terrible, but the victory was complete. Oahu was his. This triumph was not the end, but it was the decisive moment. With Oahu under his control, Kamehameha had secured the central islands. Only Kauai and Niihau remained beyond his grasp. Twice he attempted to invade them, building great fleets of canoes, preparing his warriors for the long crossing. Twice storms destroyed his plans, scattering his forces, convincing him that perhaps the gods themselves resisted his conquest. But Kamehameha was not only a man of war, he was a man of pragmatism. Instead of endless bloodshed, he turned to diplomacy. In 1810, after years of pressure, the chief of Kauai agreed to submit peacefully. With this alliance, Kamehameha had achieved what no one before him had: the unification of all the Hawaiian Islands under a single ruler. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Kamehameha the Great, as he would come to be known, established the Kingdom of Hawaii, the first and last of its kind. He ruled with the authority of a conqueror, but also with the wisdom of one who understood the fragility of his power. The kingdom was not just a military creation. It was a political and cultural revolution. For centuries, the islands had been divided, their chiefs warring and shifting alliances. Now, for the first time, they were one nation, recognized not only by their own people, but eventually by foreign powers as well. Under Kamehameha, Hawaii was no longer a chain of rival kingdoms. It was a unified state, a kingdom at the crossroads of the Pacific. Yet unification was not only about battles. It was about building legitimacy. Kamehameha carefully balanced the traditions of Kapu with the realities of a changing world. He preserved sacred customs, maintained the authority of priests, and ensured that the gods were honored. But he also embraced the tools and ideas brought by foreigners, integrating them into his rule. He allowed trade to flourish, sandalwood becoming a prized export. He established laws to protect both his people and the fragile balance of resources. One of his most famous decrees was the law of the splintered paddle, declaring that common people traveling or working should be safe from harm. A command rooted in both compassion and political shrewdness. It was said that the law came after Kamehameha himself, pursuing enemies, had been struck in the leg by a fisherman's paddle. Humbled, he vowed that ordinary people should not suffer from the ambitions of chiefs. It was a law that would echo through Hawaiian history, a symbol of justice from a warrior king. Kamehameha ruled with both ferocity and fairness. He punished disloyalty harshly, but he rewarded loyalty with land and privilege. He demanded tribute, but he also ensured protection. His presence inspired awe. His towering frame and commanding gaze made him a figure both feared and loved. To foreign visitors, he was impressive not merely as a native ruler, but as a monarch equal to those of Europe, one who commanded authority across an entire archipelago. To his people, he was the fulfillment of prophecy, the chief who had done what none before him had managed. He was not only Ali'i, he was king. The kingdom he built was fragile, resting on the delicate balance between tradition and change, between the old gods and the new world pressing upon Hawaii. But in Kamehameha's lifetime, it held. His unification brought an era of relative peace to the islands. Warfare between rival chiefs ceased. Trade expanded. Hawaii began to be recognized as a sovereign power, not just by sailors passing through, but by governments across the globe. The islands, once isolated, once fractured, now stood united, their destiny shaped by the vision and determination of one man. When Kamehameha died in 1819, the kingdom mourned deeply. His body was hidden in the ancient Hawaiian way, concealed so that no enemy could ever desecrate his remains, his mana protected even in death. The place of his burial remains a mystery to this day, a secret carried into eternity. But his legacy endured. He had carved a nation out of division, using the tools of strangers without surrendering the authority of his gods. He had bound together islands that had once fought endlessly, forging them into a single kingdom that would stand for nearly a century. His name would be remembered not only in chants and songs, but in the very identity of the Hawaiian people. He was Kamehameha the Great, conqueror of the islands, father of the kingdom, a man who rose from prophecy and left behind a nation. The world beyond Hawaii was watching. Ships continued to arrive, trade continued to grow, and the pressures of foreign influence would only increase. But for that moment in history, under Kamehameha's rule, Hawaii was whole. The islands that had been born of fire and ocean, that had been ruled by gods and chiefs, that had welcomed and killed the first stranger, were now bound together in unity. It was a fragile triumph, but it was real, and it would shape the future of Hawaii in ways no one yet imagined. Chapter 6. Kingdom in Transition. The death of Kamehameha marked the end of an era. The islands had been forged into a single kingdom by his strength, his vision, and his unrelenting will. For the first time in their history, the Hawaiian Islands stood united beneath one crown, at peace after centuries of warfare. Yet, as the people mourned their great king, the horizon was already darkening with forces even he could not have controlled. The world beyond the Pacific was pressing closer every year, carried on the sails of foreign ships and the ideas of men who came not to conquer with spears or muskets, but to change with words, with books, and with faith. In the early 19th century, Hawaii entered a period of transformation that would alter its culture, its economy, and its very soul. Only months after Kamehameha's death in 1819, the kapu system, the sacred order that had defined Hawaiian life for centuries, was abolished. His heir, Kamehameha II, with the support of powerful chiefs and especially the Queen Regent Ka'ahumanu, broke with tradition and declared the old religious restrictions null. It was a stunning moment, a revolution without swords. The sacred laws that had governed eating, worship, and social order were swept aside in an instant. Temples fell silent, idols were cast down, and the people, long bound by the weight of kapu, were left adrift. Some rejoiced at their sudden freedom. Others feared that without kapu, the wrath of the gods would descend. But change had already begun, and into that vacuum of faith arrived a new force: the missionaries. In 1820, a small band of American Protestant missionaries stepped ashore, carrying not weapons, but Bibles. They came from New England, inspired by the Great Awakening, determined to bring Christianity to the farthest corners of the world. To the Hawaiians, they were curious figures, sternly dressed, pale-skinned, speaking a language strange to the ear, accompanied by wives who played as active a role as their husbands. They set up schools, translated scriptures, and began the slow work of teaching reading and writing. For a people who had preserved their history in chants and memory, the written word was a revelation. The missionaries reduced the Hawaiian language to an alphabet, and within a generation, literacy spread at a pace astonishing even to outsiders. Ordinary farmers, fishermen, and children learned to read, and Hawaii became one of the most literate societies in the Pacific. But the missionaries brought more than literacy. They brought a strict moral code, one that often clashed with Hawaiian traditions. Practices that had been sacred were suddenly condemned. The hula, which for centuries had been a form of prayer, storytelling, and identity, was attacked as sinful, indecent, a heathen remnant of a world that must be swept away. Chiefs who once presided over festivals now listened to sermons warning them against the very dances that honored their ancestors. Gradually, under the influence of missionaries and converted rulers, hula was suppressed. Schools forbade it, churches condemned it, and the old chants fell silent. The gods of fire and ocean gave way to the God of the Bible, and Hawaiian society bent under the weight of a new faith. Not all resisted. Many Hawaiians embraced Christianity, drawn by its promise of salvation, by the dignity of literacy, by the authority it carried in a world increasingly dominated by foreigners. Chiefs converted, sometimes sincerely, sometimes strategically, seeing in the missionaries a source of knowledge and prestige. To align with the missionaries was to align with the powerful United States, whose ships were now a regular presence in Hawaiian waters. In this way, religion became entwined with politics, and faith became a tool of diplomacy as much as devotion. At the same time, Hawaii's economy was being reshaped. With the decline of traditional warfare, men who once had carried spears now found new work supplying the needs of foreign ships. Whalers, chasing the giants of the deep, began to flood into Hawaiian ports. By the 1820s and 1830s, Lahaina on Maui and Honolulu on Oahu had become bustling hubs, filled with sailors eager for rest, food, and entertainment after months at sea. The kingdom benefited from the trade. Pigs, potatoes, fresh water, and sandalwood filled the holds of ships, bringing coin and goods in exchange. Chiefs grew rich on the profits, and the economy turned outward, tied to the demands of foreign markets rather than only the cycles of taro and fish. But the whaling ships brought more than commerce. They brought chaos. Thousands of sailors crowded into ports, their pockets filled with money, their thirst for drink and pleasure insatiable. Taverns sprang up, liquor flowed, gambling thrived, and prostitution spread. For the missionaries, who had come to uplift the islands with Christian virtue, the whaling fleets were a scourge. They railed from the pulpit against the corruption of Hawaiian society, condemning drunkenness, immorality, and vice. Chiefs found themselves caught between two powerful forces: the economic necessity of the whalers, who brought wealth and trade, and the moral authority of the missionaries, who offered guidance and the approval of powerful foreign nations. Balancing the two became one of the defining challenges of the era. For ordinary Hawaiians, these changes were bewildering. The rhythms of life were shifting. Children who once learned chants at the feet of elders now sat in classrooms, reciting letters and reading scriptures. Farmers who once owed tribute to their alii now sold goods in bustling markets that smelled of salt and foreign tobacco. Women who once danced hula at sacred festivals were told to cover their bodies and sit silently in church pews. Some adapted quickly, embracing the new ways as progress. Others clung to tradition, practicing hula in secret, whispering old chants in the dark, passing down stories even as the official world condemned them. It was a time of tension, of transformation, of loss and possibility. The chiefs themselves were not immune to change. Their authority, once absolute, was now entangled with foreign advisors, foreign religion, and foreign laws. Missionaries advised kings on governance, drafting constitutions and legal codes that slowly eroded the old ways of rule. The kapu system was gone, but in its place grew a system modeled on Western law, with written statutes, courts, and prisons. To some, this was progress, a way of protecting order in a world increasingly complex. To others, it was a slow surrender of sovereignty, a yielding of Hawaiian independence to foreign ideas. Yet for the moment, it seemed necessary. To survive in the new global order, the chiefs of Hawaii believed they must adapt, even if it meant reshaping their kingdom in ways their ancestors would scarcely recognize. In the harbors, the mingling of worlds was visible each day. Tall ships stood beside double-hulled canoes. Foreign sailors drank with Hawaiian fishermen. Markets bustled with goods from China, America, and Europe, alongside poi and coconuts. Languages blended, Hawaiian, English, Chinese, Portuguese, echoing across the docks. The kingdom, once isolated, now sat at the center of a vast oceanic crossroads, a place where cultures collided and commerce thrived. It was both exhilarating and dangerous. Prosperity came hand in hand with dependency, and the influence of foreigners grew stronger with every passing year. Through it all, the Hawaiian spirit endured. Even as missionaries forbade hula, the people remembered. Even as laws replaced kapu, the sense of mana remained, the belief that the land was alive, that ancestors walked beside the living, that Hawaii was not merely a place, but a sacred trust. In secret gatherings, dancers still moved to the rhythms of drums, their hands telling stories forbidden in daylight. Elders still whispered the genealogies of chiefs, preserving memory against the tide of forgetting. The kingdom was in transition, but it was not yet lost. The people were adjusting, reshaping, finding ways to carry old identity into new forms. For a moment, Hawaii balanced between two worlds. One foot stood in the traditions of chiefs, chants, and hula. The other stepped into classrooms, churches, and courts. One hand held the paddle of the canoe, the other gripped the musket. It was a fragile balance, uncertain, but it held for a time. And in that fragile space, the Hawaiian kingdom tried to chart its course, pulled by the winds of whalers, the voices of missionaries, and the restless desires of chiefs. The islands that Kamehameha had united were now being remade, not by conquest, but by ideas, by faith, and by trade. It was a transformation no less profound than any battle, a struggle fought not on beaches, but in hearts and minds. The kingdom was changing, and with it, the destiny of its people. The old ways were fading, the new ways still uncertain. Hawaii stood at a crossroads, its identity tested, its sovereignty under pressure, its culture reshaped. The transition had begun, and it would lead to trials greater than any the islands had yet faced. But for now, in the early decades of the 19th century, the story was one of restless change. The hum of schools, the silence of forbidden hula, the clamor of whaling ports, the stern prayers of missionaries, and the question that lingered in every mind. What would it mean to be Hawaiian in a world that was no longer only their own? Chapter 7. Sugar and Power. The hum of whaling ships and the voices of missionaries had already begun to reshape the Hawaiian kingdom, But another force soon rose that would alter the islands even more profoundly. It was not a faith or a fleet, but a crop, tall, green, and sweet. Sugar cane had grown in Hawaii since the first Polynesian settlers planted it centuries earlier, used in small quantities for food and medicine. But in the 19th century, sugar would cease to be a simple plant of the garden and instead become the foundation of an entire economy. It would bring wealth to some, hardship to others, and bind Hawaii's destiny to forces far beyond its shores. The age of sugar was beginning, and with it came power, profit, and peril. The shift began slowly. As foreign ships continued to stop in Hawaii, traders recognized the island's fertile soil and favorable climate. The same volcanic richness that fed taro fields and breadfruit groves could produce sugar cane on a scale that rivaled plantations in the Caribbean or the American South. Early experiments proved successful, and soon Hawaiian chiefs and foreign entrepreneurs alike turned their attention to sugar as a commodity for export. At first, production was modest, small mills grinding cane into raw sugar. But as global demand soared and as treaties opened trade with the United States, sugar became more than a crop. It became the lifeblood of the kingdom's economy. Plantations spread across the islands, reshaping the land. Valleys that had once held taro were converted into rows of cane. Water that had once flowed into fish ponds was diverted into irrigation ditches. Entire landscapes were transformed to feed the hunger of distant markets. Mills rose along the coasts, their smokestacks billowing as cane was crushed and boiled. The rhythm of life changed with the harvest, not by the cycles of gods or chiefs, but by the demands of contracts and ships that waited to carry sugar across the sea. What had once been a self-sufficient economy turned outward, tethered to the price of sugar in foreign ports. But sugar required more than soil and sun. It required labor, backbreaking, endless labor. The Hawaiian population, already weakened by disease since the arrival of foreigners, could not provide enough workers for the growing plantations. Entire villages had vanished under epidemics, leaving gaps in the workforce that could not be filled. The planters, ambitious and hungry for profit, looked beyond the islands for hands to cut their cane. And so began one of the most significant migrations in Hawaiian history, the arrival of laborers from around the world. The first came from China. In the mid-19th century, Chinese men began to arrive in large numbers, recruited by planters desperate for cheap labor. They signed contracts binding them to years of work in the fields, swinging machetes under the hot sun, bending their backs over endless rows of cane. Life was harsh. The work was grueling, the pay meager, the conditions often brutal. Yet many endured, some eventually leaving the plantations to start small shops and businesses in towns, planting the roots of what would become Hawaii's Chinese community. After the Chinese came workers from Japan. In the 1880s, treaties were signed that allowed the recruitment of thousands of Japanese laborers. Entire villages in Japan emptied as men boarded ships for the long voyage across the Pacific, drawn by the promise of wages. Like the Chinese before them, they found hardship and toil in the cane fields, rising before dawn, cutting and hauling under overseers who demanded more than bodies could give. But they too endured, sending money back to families, building communities, and in time, planting themselves permanently in Hawaii's soil. The flow did not stop there. From Portugal came men and women, often from the Azores and Madeira, bringing with them music, bread, and traditions that would blend into Hawaii's culture. From the Philippines came thousands more, driven by poverty at home, willing to endure the hardships of plantation life in exchange for a chance at survival. Over the decades, wave after wave of immigrant labor arrived, each group adding its language, its food, its customs to the islands. Hawaii became a mosaic of cultures, bound together not by shared origin, but by shared toil in the cane fields. For the kingdom, this influx of labor brought both prosperity and peril. On one hand, sugar production skyrocketed. Ships carried Hawaiian sugar to California, to New England, to markets across the Pacific. Wealth flowed into the islands, enriching planters, chiefs, and foreign investors. The kingdom's economy grew rapidly, and for a time, sugar seemed a miracle crop, the foundation of modern prosperity. On the other hand, this prosperity came at a price. The reliance on immigrant labor created deep divisions in society, pitting native Hawaiians, foreigners, and newcomers into different classes. The land itself, once held collectively, was increasingly controlled by those who owned plantations, consolidating power into fewer and fewer hands. The political influence of sugar could not be ignored. Planters became powerful voices in the kingdom, their wealth giving them leverage over kings and chiefs. Treaties were signed to reduce tariffs, ensuring Hawaiian sugar could enter American markets cheaply. Each treaty drew Hawaii closer to the orbit of the United States, binding its economy to a single buyer. Independence remained in name, but in practice, the kingdom's survival depended on sugar exports and the favor of foreign powers. The crop that had brought prosperity also brought dependency. For ordinary laborers, the life of the plantation was hard and unforgiving. Days began before sunrise, the sound of the overseer's whistle calling men and women into the fields. Machetes swung, cutting down the towering cane stalks that cut skin and left hands blistered. Bundles were carried to carts, hauled to mills, fed into crushing rollers that groaned and shrieked as sweet juice poured out. Fires burned day and night as sugar was boiled, crystallized, and packed for shipment. Heat, exhaustion, and injury were constant companions. The air was filled with ash and smoke, the ground with sweat. When the day finally ended, workers returned to crowded camps, their bodies aching, their spirits weary. Yet even here, life persisted. In the camps, workers carved out community. The Chinese brewed tea and cooked noodles. The Japanese planted small gardens and shared rice. The Portuguese strummed guitars and baked sweet bread. Filipinos told stories by firelight, their voices mingling with songs of longing. Over time, these traditions blended. Food, music, and customs mixed into a cultural stew unique to Hawaii. What began as a hardship laid the foundation for the island's multicultural identity, a legacy that endures to this day. Still, beneath the surface, tension simmered. The harshness of plantation life led to discontent, strikes, and resistance. Workers demanded better wages, better conditions, dignity in their labor. Though often crushed by planters who wielded both wealth and influence, these small acts of defiance planted seeds of future struggle. Hawaii was no longer simply the land of chiefs and kapu, nor the kingdom Kamehameha had built. It was becoming a land of competing interests, of planters, missionaries, laborers, and foreign powers, all bound together by sugar. For the Hawaiian people, the transformation was profound. The taro fields of their ancestors gave way to sugarcane owned by others. The fish ponds that had once sustained them were neglected or destroyed. Many found themselves working as laborers on lands that had once belonged to their families, their independence slipping away under the weight of contracts and debts. Some adapted, finding places within the new economy. Others resisted, clinging to traditions, lamenting the changes that seemed to erode the foundation of their culture. The kingdom was prospering, but native Hawaiians often paid the heaviest price. And yet, sugar was irresistible. It brought schools, churches, and towns. It brought ships filled with goods from around the world. It gave the kingdom recognition in foreign capitals. Its sugar traded on the same markets as that of empires. It made Hawaii wealthy, but also vulnerable. For as dependence on sugar grew, so too did the influence of those who controlled it. The kingdom's fate became increasingly tied not to the will of its chiefs or its people, but to the demands of plantations and the markets beyond the sea. By the mid-19th century, the transformation was unmistakable. Where once villages had lived by the cycles of planting and fishing, now the land was dominated by sprawling fields of cane. Where once chiefs had ruled by mana and kapu, now planters and merchants whispered in the ears of kings. The kingdom was still Hawaiian, but its heart was beating to the rhythm of sugar. And that rhythm would guide it, for better or worse, into the turbulent years ahead. The age of sugar had dawned. It promised wealth, it brought change, and it reshaped Hawaii into something new. But prosperity came at the cost of dependency, and power rested in hands not always Hawaiian. The sweetness of sugar masked a bitter truth, that the kingdom's future was no longer entirely its own. Chapter 8. Queens and Kings in a Changing World. The age of sugar had transformed Hawaii's land and economy, but the story of the kingdom was not only told in the cane fields and mills. It was written in the palaces, in the decisions of monarchs who tried to guide their islands through a century of enormous change. Kamehameha the Great had built unity through conquest, but his successors faced a far more complex challenge: preserving sovereignty in a world where foreign influence grew stronger with each passing year. The throne of Hawaii in the 19th century became less a symbol of absolute power and more a balancing act, a seat caught between tradition and modernity, between native pride and foreign pressure. The kings and queens who wore the crown each left their mark, some remembered for strength, others for extravagance, and one, above all, for tragedy. Kamehameha II, who inherited the throne after his father's death, ruled in a moment of upheaval. With the support of powerful chiefs and the queen regent Ka'ahumanu, he abolished the kapu system that had guided Hawaiian life for centuries. The act shattered the foundation of ancient religion, leaving society without the sacred laws that had long bound it. The move opened the door wide for missionaries, who arrived soon after and established Christianity as the new moral framework of the islands. The young king himself traveled to London, seeking recognition from the British crown, but his journey ended in sorrow. He and his queen fell victim to measles, dying far from home in 1824, a grim reminder of the diseases that continued to devastate the Hawaiian population. The throne passed to Kamehameha III, a ruler who reigned for nearly 3 decades and oversaw enormous transformations. He faced mounting foreign pressure, with Britain and France both seeking influence in the islands. At one point, British forces even occupied Hawaii briefly in 1843, raising their flag above the land. Though sovereignty was restored after protests and diplomacy, the incident showed how fragile independence had become. Kamehameha III recognized that the kingdom could not remain isolated, and so he adopted elements of Western governance. He granted Hawaii its first constitution in 1840, establishing a constitutional monarchy, creating a legislature, and setting the framework for law. It was a bold attempt to balance Hawaiian sovereignty with Western expectations of civilized rule. At the same time, his reign saw the Great Mahel, a division of lands that broke with centuries of communal ownership. Intended to modernize and protect property rights, it instead opened the door for foreign acquisition, as Hawaiians unfamiliar with the new system lost their lands, and vast tracts fell to the hands of foreigners and plantation owners. Kamehameha III sought to safeguard his kingdom, but the changes of his reign cut deep, reshaping the very foundation of Hawaiian society. Kamehameha IV and Kamehameha V continued the dynasty, each in his own way grappling with the demands of modernity. Kamehameha IV, educated and worldly, sought to steer Hawaii toward cultural refinement. He and his queen, Emma, promoted hospitals, schools, and charities, caring deeply for the health and well-being of their people, who continued to suffer under epidemics. Their reign reflected compassion and dignity, though his life was cut short. Kamehameha V, more traditional, sought to strengthen the monarchy against foreign intrusion. He abolished the earlier constitution and replaced it with one that restored greater powers to the crown, a reminder that even as Western influence grew, the monarchy still struggled to hold authority in Hawaiian hands. Yet despite their efforts, the dynasty began to wane. When Kamehameha V died without an heir in 1872, the direct line of the great conqueror came to an end, and the kingdom entered a new, uncertain chapter. The next monarchs were elected by the legislature, a process watched closely by foreign powers and wealthy planters who had grown influential in Hawaiian affairs. Out of this system emerged King Kalakaua, a figure whose reign would be remembered for its contradictions, lavish in spectacle, proud in defense of Hawaiian culture, yet deeply entangled in the politics of sugar and foreign treaties. Kalakaua was known as the Merry Monarch, a man who loved music, dance, and celebration. He revived traditions that missionaries had suppressed, including hula, restoring it as a vital expression of Hawaiian identity. Under his reign, chants and dances once again filled the air, reconnecting the people with the rhythms of their ancestors. He built Iolani Palace, a magnificent structure in Honolulu, adorned with electric lights and European furnishings, a symbol to the world that Hawaii was not a backwater, but a kingdom equal in refinement to any in the West. But Kalakaua's love of grandeur came at a cost. His travels abroad, his ambitious projects, and his efforts to assert Hawaiian pride were viewed by some as extravagance, draining the treasury at a time when the kingdom was increasingly dependent on sugar exports. Foreign planters, many of them American, pressed for closer economic ties with the United States. Under pressure, Kalakaua signed the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875, allowing Hawaiian sugar to enter American markets duty-free. The treaty brought wealth and expanded plantations, but it also deepened dependency on a single export and tied Hawaii ever closer to the orbit of the United States. Prosperity flowed, but sovereignty bent. In time, Kalakaua himself was forced to sign what became known as the Bayonet Constitution in 1887, a document imposed by armed militia that stripped the monarchy of much of its authority, transferred power to the legislature, and granted voting rights to foreigners while limiting those of native Hawaiians. The king who had revived Hawaiian culture was left politically weakened, his crown reduced to a symbol as the true power shifted into the hands of planters and businessmen. When Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister ascended the throne. She was Liliuokalani, Hawaii's last monarch, and her reign would be defined by struggle. Unlike her brother, she was not content to let the monarchy remain powerless. Intelligent, determined, and fiercely protective of her people, she sought to restore the authority of the crown and defend Hawaiian sovereignty against the growing dominance of foreign interests. In 1893, she introduced a new constitution, one that would restore voting rights to native Hawaiians and return power to the throne. It was a bold move, an attempt to reverse the tide of foreign control and reassert independence. But the forces aligned against her were strong. American planters, backed by businessmen and with the quiet support of the United States minister, saw her actions as a threat to their interests. In January of that year, they staged a coup, deposing the Queen and proclaiming a provisional government. Marines from American ships landed in Honolulu, their presence ensuring that resistance would falter. Faced with overwhelming force, Liliuokalani yielded, believing that the United States, once informed, would restore her throne. She was wrong. Her struggle did not end with her overthrow. She petitioned in Washington, wrote songs and memoirs, and became a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice. But her kingdom was gone, replaced by a government that would in time pave the way for annexation. Her reign had been short, her efforts thwarted, but her legacy endured. She was remembered as a queen who fought, who stood firm in defense of her people even as the tide of history swept against her. To this day, her words, her music, her defiance echo as reminders of what was lost and what was preserved. The monarchy of the 19th century was thus a story of change, of kings and queens navigating storms of foreign pressure, economic dependency, and cultural transformation. From Kamehameha II's abolition of kapu, to Kamehameha III's constitutions and land reforms, to Kalakaua's celebrations and humiliations, to Liliuokalani's tragic overthrow. Each monarch reflected the struggle to preserve Hawaiian identity in a changing world. They were not rulers of the old type, commanding absolute loyalty through mana and kepu, nor were they rulers free to govern without interference. They were figures caught in the currents of empire, striving to steer their fragile kingdom through the rising waves of foreign ambition. And yet, for all the challenges, the monarchy gave Hawaii its dignity. It asserted that this chain of islands in the middle of the Pacific was not a colony, but a kingdom, with kings and queens, with palaces and constitutions, with a culture both ancient and alive. Their reigns were imperfect, their choices sometimes flawed, but they stood as the embodiment of Hawaiian sovereignty. When the last queen was forced from her throne, the loss was not only political, but spiritual, the end of a tradition that stretched back to Kamehameha the Great. The crown had guided Hawaii through a century of change, but in the end, it could not withstand the weight of foreign power. What remained was memory, pride, and the enduring spirit of a people who would not forget. Chapter 9: Overthrow and Annexation. The Hawaiian monarchy had survived decades of pressure, compromise, and reform. But by the closing years of the 19th century, it stood on fragile ground. The sugar that had fueled the kingdom's economy had also bound it tightly to the interests of foreign planters, especially those from the United States. The Reciprocity Treaty of 1875 had opened American markets to Hawaiian sugar. But in doing so, it had tethered the kingdom's prosperity to decisions made in Washington. The Bayonet Constitution of 1887 had already stripped the monarchy of much of its power, transferring influence into the hands of planters and businessmen. By the time Queen Liliuokalani ascended the throne in 1891, she faced a kingdom that was Hawaiian in name, but increasingly controlled by outsiders. Still, she refused to surrender quietly. She sought to restore the power of the crown and protect her people's voice in their own land. Her efforts, however, would collide with the ambitions of men who had no interest in a sovereign Hawaii. The Queen's proposed Constitution of 1893 was the spark. Determined to undo the Bayonet Constitution, she drafted a new document that would restore voting rights to Native Hawaiians, reduce the power of wealthy foreigners, and reassert authority in the monarchy. For the Queen, it was not an act of arrogance, but of justice, an attempt to preserve the dignity of her nation. For the group of American businessmen and planners who had grown accustomed to ruling through legislatures and boards, it was a direct threat to their power and profits. They called themselves the Committee of Safety, but their true mission was not safety, it was control. In January 1893, they acted. Backed by the presence of U.S. Marines who landed from the USS Boston under the pretense of protecting American lives and property, they declared the monarchy overthrown. The Queen, confronted by the rifles of foreigners and the betrayal of men she had once considered allies, realized that resistance would lead only to bloodshed. Hawaiian forces loyal to her were ready to fight, but she saw the imbalance of power clearly. To fight would be to invite massacre, the destruction of her people in the streets of Honolulu. And so, in a gesture of both dignity and desperation, she yielded her throne, not to the conspirators, but to the United States government, believing that once the truth was known, justice would be restored. Her faith was misplaced. President Grover Cleveland, upon reviewing the events, called the overthrow illegal and dishonorable. He proposed restoring the Queen, recognizing that American citizens had played an unlawful role in the coup. But in Hawaii, the provisional government established by the conspirators had no intention of stepping aside. They rejected Cleveland's demands, confident that time and circumstance would secure their victory. In the United States, political winds shifted. By the time William McKinley assumed the presidency, expansionism was in the air. Hawaii was no longer seen merely as a kingdom in the Pacific, but as a strategic prize. Meanwhile, the Queen endured humiliation. She was placed under house arrest after a failed attempt by Loyalists to restore her in 1895, accused of knowing of the plot, though no evidence proved her guilt. She was forced to formally abdicate under duress, her palace turned into government offices, her authority erased. Yet even stripped of power, she became a symbol of resistance. In her writings, in her songs, in her quiet dignity, she carried the sorrow of a nation that had lost its sovereignty. The Hawaiian people mourned not only the loss of their queen, but of their independence. A kingdom that had once stood proud among nations now stood as a government in name only, controlled by men whose loyalty lay across the sea. The provisional government declared itself the Republic of Hawaii in 1894, with Sanford B. Dole as president. To its leaders, annexation by the United States was the ultimate goal, the guarantee of their power and security. Yet, in the United States, debate raged. Some saw annexation as a betrayal of American ideals, the conquest of a small nation by a larger one. Others argued that Hawaii was too vital to ignore, its harbors too strategic, its sugar too valuable. For a time, annexation stalled, blocked by those who questioned its legality and morality. Hawaii remained in limbo, a republic recognized by some but opposed by many, its people caught between the reality of foreign control and the hope of restored sovereignty. That hope faded in 1898, when war changed everything. The Spanish-American War erupted, and suddenly the islands that had once seemed distant were of urgent importance. The United States needed a Pacific base for its navy, a place where coal and supplies could be stored, a harbor from which ships could project power into Asia. Pearl Harbor, with its deep waters, was the perfect answer. Strategists declared that Hawaii was no longer optional. It was essential. In this atmosphere, annexation was no longer debated as a moral question, but as a matter of national security. That summer, Congress passed the New Lands Resolution, and Hawaii was annexed to the United States. There was no plebiscite, no vote of the Hawaiian people, no moment when the voice of the nation was heard. The decision was made in Washington, carried out by signatures on paper, and declared final. On August 12, 1898, the American flag was raised over Iolani Palace, the symbol of the monarchy now transformed into a trophy of conquest. Sanford Dole, the President of the Republic, stood with American officials as the Hawaiian crown was lowered and replaced with stars and stripes. For many Hawaiians, it was a day of mourning, a funeral for their independence. Queen Liliuokalani, dignified even in defeat, refused to attend. She remained in her home, her sorrow private, her protest unyielding. The annexation of Hawaii was celebrated by some in the United States as a triumph of progress and expansion. Politicians declared that the islands were better off under American rule, that they had been saved from mismanagement and instability. Businessmen rejoiced at the security of their plantations, their profits guaranteed by access to American markets without tariff. Strategists congratulated themselves on securing Pearl Harbor, the jewel of the Pacific, a base that would indeed shape American power in the century to come. But for Hawaiians, it was a wound that has never fully healed. The kingdom their ancestors had built, the monarchy that had stood against storms of foreign pressure, the crown that had once belonged to Kamehameha and Liliuokalani was gone. In its place stood a territory, governed not by alii or elected kings, but by officials appointed in Washington. The voices of the Hawaiian people were silenced in the halls of power. Their land, their culture, their sovereignty, each was diminished. Some adapted, finding ways to survive within the new order. Others resisted quietly, preserving chants, dances, and language in secret, refusing to let their identity be erased. The struggle to remain Hawaiian in the face of annexation had only begun. The overthrow of 1893 and the annexation of 1898 marked the end of the monarchy and the loss of independence. But they were also moments that revealed resilience. Liliuokalani never ceased to assert her people's right to sovereignty, even when stripped of her crown. She became a symbol not only of what was lost, but of what endured. Her songs, especially the haunting Aloha O, carried both sorrow and love. A farewell not only to a lover, but to a kingdom, a lament sung across generations. To this day, her voice echoes as a reminder that though Hawaii was annexed, its spirit was never conquered. Thus, the islands entered a new chapter, no longer a kingdom, but a territory of the United States. The path that had begun with fire and gods, with chiefs and kapu, with canoes crossing an endless sea, had now led to the raising of a foreign flag over Iolani Palace. Hawaii had been drawn into the currents of empire, caught in the ambitions of nations far larger than itself. For the Hawaiian people, the struggle to hold on to identity, dignity, and sovereignty would continue in new forms. But for now, The story was one of loss, of a queen deposed, a kingdom overthrown, and a nation annexed against its will. Chapter 10. Hawaii and the World at War. Annexation had placed Hawaii firmly under the control of the United States, transforming the kingdom into a territory governed by Washington rather than by its own kings and queens. The islands, once sovereign, now became a stepping stone in America's expanding reach across the Pacific. For some, this new identity as an American territory brought opportunities, economic growth, modernization, and access to trade. For others, it was a reminder of what had been lost, a crown lowered, a voice silenced. Yet regardless of where one stood, the islands now belonged to a global empire, and their fate would be tied to the great conflicts of the 20th century. From the moment of annexation in 1898, Hawaii's strategic value was clear. Pearl Harbor, long recognized for its deep natural anchorage, became the jewel of America's Pacific defenses. The U.S. Navy expanded its presence, building docks, warehouses, and dry docks, turning the harbor into a fortress of steel and ships. Honolulu grew alongside it, swelling with merchants, workers, and soldiers. The cane fields continued to hum, the plantations exporting sugar that fed American markets. But in the background, the real heartbeat of Hawaii was no longer only in agriculture. It was in Pearl Harbor, where battleships lined the piers and aircraft roared overhead. By the 1930s, as tensions grew in Asia, Hawaii became ever more vital. Japan, rising as a Pacific power, extended its reach across East Asia, alarming both Europe and the United States. The islands, perched midway between the American mainland and Asia, stood as both a shield and a target. For Hawaiians and immigrants alike, those working in cane fields, in schools, in docks, the growing military presence was impossible to ignore. Soldiers filled the streets, bases expanded, and the sense of looming conflict thickened in the humid air. Some feared what it meant. Others welcomed the protection, believing that the great fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor would keep danger far away. The morning of December 7th, 1941, shattered that illusion. It began like any other Sunday. The sky was clear, the air warm. And across Oahu, people prepared for church or enjoyed a quiet morning. On the waters of Pearl Harbor, battleships rested at anchor, their crews relaxed, unaware of the danger approaching. Then, shortly before 8 o'clock, the first wave of Japanese planes swept down from the north, engines screaming, sunlight flashing off wings painted with the red circle of the rising sun. Bombs fell, torpedoes streaked through the water, and in an instant, paradise became a battlefield. The USS Arizona was struck and exploded in a fireball. Its steel hull ripped open, sending more than 1,000 sailors to their deaths in moments. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping men below deck. Flames engulfed ships, plumes of smoke darkened the sky, and the harbor filled with chaos. Men leapt into the water to escape the inferno, swimming through oil that burned atop the waves. Across the island, airfields were bombed, planes destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Civilians watched in horror as bombs fell not only on military targets, but on neighborhoods, leaving destruction in their wake. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were killed, many of them in Hawaii, many of them Hawaiian residents who had woken that morning, never imagining war would find them at home. The attack stunned the world. For Hawaii, it was a wound etched deep into memory, a moment that forever changed the island's place in history. For the United States, It was the catalyst that pulled the nation into World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. And from that day, Hawaii stood not on the margins, but at the very center of the Pacific theater of war. The immediate aftermath transformed everyday life on the islands. Martial law was declared, and the territorial government was effectively suspended. Military governors ruled Hawaii with sweeping authority, controlling nearly every aspect of life. Curfews were imposed. Blackouts darkened Honolulu at night, every window covered, every streetlight extinguished to prevent enemy bombers from finding targets. Civilian courts were closed, replaced by military tribunals. Movement was restricted, gatherings monitored, and censorship imposed. For Hawaiians, Japanese immigrants, and all residents alike, daily life was no longer their own. It belonged to the military. The fear of invasion was palpable. Rumors spread that Japanese troops might land at any moment. The paratroopers could descend upon the cane fields. Beaches were lined with barbed wire, trenches dug across parks and streets. Children carried gas masks, families practiced air raid drills, and the once open shores of Waikik became guarded and grim. The islands had become a fortress, their people conscripted not only into service, but into constant vigilance. For Japanese Americans in Hawaii, who made up a large portion of the population, the war brought suspicion and hardship. On the mainland, entire communities were uprooted and placed in internment camps. In Hawaii, mass internment was impossible due to sheer numbers. But thousands of community leaders, teachers, priests, businessmen, were arrested and sent to camps on the mainland or held on the islands. Families lived under suspicion, neighbors eyed one another warily, and loyalty was constantly questioned. And yet, from this same community would rise acts of extraordinary patriotism. The 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed largely of Japanese Americans from Hawaii, went on to fight in Europe with unmatched courage, becoming some of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. Their service was both a testament to loyalty and a challenge to prejudice, proving in blood what could not be denied. Meanwhile, the islands themselves became the beating heart of America's war in the Pacific. Ships streamed out of Pearl Harbor, heading to battles across the ocean. From Midway to Guadalcanal, from the Philippines to Okinawa. Airfields buzzed with bombers and fighters, carrying the war toward Japan. Soldiers by the tens of thousands trained on Hawaiian soil, preparing for invasions. Civilians worked tirelessly to support the war effort, laboring in docks, canneries, and fields. The economy shifted from sugar alone to wartime production. The hum of mills joined by the roar of engines and the march of boots. Honolulu became a city of uniforms, every street filled with soldiers, sailors, nurses, and officers, their presence transforming the rhythms of daily life. The war also brought new connections. Servicemen from across the United States experienced Hawaii for the first time, encountering its culture, its landscapes, its people. They carried back memories of beaches and luau's, of hula and aloha, even as they prepared to risk their lives across the Pacific. For many, Hawaii became a symbol of both paradise and peril, a place where beauty met the hard edge of war. These impressions would linger long after the fighting ended, shaping how Americans viewed the islands in the decades to come. For the Hawaiian people, the war years were marked by sacrifice, resilience, and adaptation. Families endured rationing, shortages, and the constant presence of the military in their lives. Farmers shifted production to feed the troops. Children grew up in the shadow of barbed wire and bomb shelters. Women took on new roles, working in factories and offices, sustaining families while fathers and brothers served abroad. The war demanded everything, and the islands gave it. By 1945, as the conflict neared its end, Hawaii had been utterly transformed. The Pearl Harbor attack had brought the islands into the consciousness of the world, no longer a distant territory, but a symbol of America's vulnerability and resolve. The years of martial law had altered governance, embedding military influence deep into Hawaiian life. The war economy had accelerated modernization, shifting Honolulu into a bustling metropolis, its skyline dotted with military installations. And the people, diverse in origin yet united by shared struggle, had endured trials that reshaped identity. When victory was declared and the guns finally fell silent, Hawaii stood changed. The war had cost lives, scarred landscapes, and imposed hardship, but it had also elevated the island's importance. No longer simply a territory, Hawaii had proven itself indispensable to America's survival and triumph in the Pacific. The path ahead would bring new debates, new struggles, and new transformations. But in those war years, one truth was undeniable. Hawaii had moved from the edge of empire to its very center. The memory of December 7th, the sight of ships burning in Pearl Harbor, the sound of sirens and bombs would remain forever etched in the hearts of those who lived through it. It was the moment when Hawaii's destiny was bound irrevocably to the fortunes of the United States. And though the monarchy was gone, though sovereignty had been lost, the islands had once again shown resilience in the face of forces larger than themselves. From the chants of ancestors to the roar of plains, Hawaii's story was one of survival, adaptation, and identity. And in the crucible of World War II, that story had taken on new, global meaning. Chapter 11. Statehood, the 50th star. When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, Hawaii was left forever changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor had placed the islands at the center of America's war in the Pacific, and the years that followed had brought martial law, sacrifice, and an economy bent entirely toward survival. As the war ended, soldiers boarded ships home, the blackout curtains were lifted, and the beaches were cleared of barbed wire. For the first time in years, the islands could breathe again. Yet the war had also accelerated a transformation that could not be reversed. Hawaii was no longer just an American territory in the middle of the ocean. It was a place the world now knew, a place America had depended upon, and a place whose future would no longer be decided in isolation. The question was no longer whether Hawaii mattered. It was whether Hawaii would finally become part of the United States as its 50th star. In the years immediately after the war, the push for statehood gained momentum. Hawaii had proven itself indispensable during the conflict. Its ports, airfields, and people had supported victory, and its residents, Japanese, Hawaiian, Portuguese, Filipino, Chinese, and more, had shown loyalty under the strain of martial law. Leaders in Honolulu began to argue that Hawaii had earned equality. If Hawaiians could die in uniform under the American flag, they said, then surely they deserved the rights of full citizenship, not the partial voice of a territory. Territorial status left them governed by officials appointed in Washington rather than chosen at home. Statehood, its advocates declared, would mean dignity, self-determination, and equality under the Constitution. But the road was not simple. In Washington, debates flared. Some lawmakers doubted whether Hawaii could truly be considered American. Its people were too diverse, too far from the mainland, too unlike the white majority states of the Union. Others raised concerns about loyalty, pointing to the large Japanese population and wondering whether Hawaii might ever fully belong. For years, these arguments stalled progress. Petitions were sent, delegates lobbied Congress, and local leaders campaigned tirelessly. But each attempt seemed to falter against prejudice and politics. Meanwhile, Hawaii itself was changing. The war had brought modernization at breakneck speed. Honolulu expanded into a bustling metropolis, its streets lined with cars, its neighborhoods swelling with new housing. The economy boomed, no longer dependent only on sugar, but fueled by military spending, tourism, and construction. Air travel shrank the distance between the islands and the mainland, making Hawaii more accessible than ever before. Soldiers who had passed through during the war returned as tourists, eager to revisit beaches they had once seen under barbed wire. The image of Hawaii as paradise, a place of hula, aloha, and sun-drenched shores, took root in American imagination. This image helped fuel the case for statehood, making Hawaii seem less like a distant outpost and more like a natural part of the United States. Still, resistance remained. For some in Congress, the idea of adding a state so far away, populated by so many non-white citizens, was uncomfortable. For some in Hawaii, especially native Hawaiians, the push for statehood was complicated. Many still mourned the loss of the kingdom, the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani, and the annexation carried out without the people's consent. For them, the question was not whether Hawaii should be a state, but whether Hawaii had ever truly agreed to belong to the United States in the first place. Statehood promised equality within America, but it also seemed to cement the loss of independence forever. Through the 1940s and 1950s, the debate raged. Each year, the call grew louder. Rallies were held, marches organized, slogans chanted, "Statehood now." Banners flew across Honolulu demanding justice, while delegations traveled to Washington to plead their case. The people of Hawaii voted overwhelmingly in support of statehood in local referendums, showing their desire to be recognized fully. Yet each time, Congress hesitated. The breakthrough came in the late 1950s, when political winds shifted. The civil rights movement was beginning to reshape America's conscience, and the idea of equality resonated more deeply. Alaska, too, was pressing for statehood, and many lawmakers recognized that admitting both Alaska and Hawaii together would balance political power. With momentum building, the arguments against Hawaii began to crumble. Its loyalty during the war was undeniable. Its strategic importance was unquestioned. Its people, though diverse, were American citizens who demanded the same rights as any other. In March 1959, Congress finally passed the Hawaii Admission Act, offering the people of Hawaii the chance to decide in a binding vote. That summer, Hawaiians went to the polls. The question was simple. Should Hawaii become a state of the United States of America? The answer was resounding. More than 90% voted yes, a landslide that stunned even its strongest advocates. On August 21, 1959, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the proclamation, and Hawaii officially became the 50th state of the Union. The American flag was redesigned, a new star added, and the islands that had once been a kingdom were now fully integrated into the republic that had annexed them 61 years earlier. The celebrations were immense. Fireworks lit the skies over Honolulu. Parades filled the streets. Newspapers across the nation declared the Union complete, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For many in Hawaii, it was a moment of pride, a validation of decades of struggle. No longer would they be second-class citizens under a territorial government. They would elect their own senators, their own representatives. Their voice would echo in Congress. Their vote would count in choosing the president. After generations of petitions, protests, and disappointment, Hawaii was at last equal in name and in law. But beneath the celebration lay controversy. For native Hawaiians, statehood was not simply a triumph. It was a reminder of a deeper loss. The vote of 1959 had not included the question of independence. The choice offered was only between statehood and remaining a territory. The possibility of restoring sovereignty, of undoing the overthrow of the monarchy, was never on the ballot. To many Hawaiians, this made the result hollow. Yes, statehood brought rights, but it also cemented annexation, closing the door on a kingdom that had once been theirs. For some, the 50th star represented equality. For others, it represented erasure. The years after statehood brought rapid change. Tourism exploded, transforming Waikika into a world-famous resort, its beaches lined with hotels and its streets filled with visitors from around the globe. Military bases expanded further, embedding the United States more deeply into Hawaiian soil. Politics shifted as new leaders rose from immigrant communities once bound to the plantations, their voices now shaping policy. For native Hawaiians, the struggle to preserve language, culture, and identity grew more urgent as development threatened sacred lands and traditions. The meaning of statehood was not simple. It was both a triumph of inclusion and a symbol of colonization. Yet no matter where one stood, the fact was clear. Hawaii had entered a new era. The crown of Kamehameha and Liliuokalani was gone, but in its place stood senators, representatives, and a star on the flag. The journey from volcanic birth to kingdom, from monarchy to annexation, from territory to state, had reached its conclusion. Hawaii was now part of the United States, inseparable in law and in image. The islands were American, yet still Hawaiian, carrying both identities in a tension that would shape their future. On August 21, 1959, when the 50th star was raised, some wept with joy, others with sorrow. For all, it was history. And as the fireworks faded and the celebrations ended, Hawaii awoke to a new reality, one in which its destiny was no longer only its own, but bound forever to a nation across the sea. Chapter 12. Hawaii Today. Aloha and Identity. When Hawaii became the 50th star on the American flag in 1959, the islands were thrust into a new era. The ceremonies were filled with pride and spectacle, but they marked not an ending, only a beginning. The decades that followed brought change at a speed greater than anything Hawaii had experienced before. Jet planes now carried visitors across the Pacific in hours rather than weeks. Developers looked at the beaches and valleys not as ancestral lands or battlefields of old, but as opportunities for hotels, highways, and resorts. The world, once so far away, now poured into Hawaii every day, filling its streets with tourists seeking paradise. And yet, beneath the sun and spectacle, the people of Hawaii wrestled with questions of identity, memory, and sovereignty that have never fully faded. Tourism became the engine of Hawaii's modern economy. Where sugar and pineapple once dominated, the image of Hawaii itself became the commodity. Photographs of Waikika Beach, of Diamond Head rising against the horizon, of hula dancers swaying in grass skirts, were splashed across magazines and posters. Airlines marketed Hawaii as America's Pacific playground, promising sun, surf, and aloha to every visitor. Hotels rose like towers along the shoreline, their neon lights reflecting against the water. Restaurants, luau's, and souvenir shops turned tradition into entertainment, packaging culture for consumption. By the 1970s, millions of visitors arrived each year, and tourism had become the backbone of the economy, eclipsing the plantations that had once ruled the land. This boom brought prosperity, but also tension. The influx of visitors brought jobs in hotels, restaurants, and shops. But it also drove up the cost of living, crowded the streets, and transformed neighborhoods. Ancient sites were bulldozed to make way for resorts, sacred valleys threatened by development. The very paradise that was being sold to the world often came at the expense of the people who called Hawaii home. Native Hawaiians watched as land once tied to their ancestors was commercialized, their culture reduced to a postcard image. The word aloha, which had once carried a deep spiritual meaning of love, compassion, and connection, was splashed onto license plates, t-shirts, and tourist brochures. To some it was progress. To others, it was desecration. At the same time, Hawaii faced environmental challenges of unprecedented scale. The islands, delicate ecosystems born of volcanic soil and ocean currents, struggled under the weight of rapid development. Forests that had once stretched across valleys were cleared. Streams that had fed taro fields were diverted for hotels and golf courses. Native species, already fragile, were pushed toward extinction by invasive plants and animals carried in by ships and planes. Coral reefs suffered from pollution, beaches eroded, and the balance of land and sea that had sustained Hawaii for centuries was under threat. For many, the paradise that tourists sought was in danger of vanishing, consumed by the very industry that sold it. Yet, even as Hawaii was being reshaped, a revival was stirring. In the 1970s and beyond, Native Hawaiians began to reclaim their culture, language, and traditions. After decades of suppression, hula returned not as tourist entertainment, but as sacred practice. Performed in ceremonies, taught in schools, and celebrated at festivals like the Merry Monarch, named after King Kalakaua. The Hawaiian language, nearly lost after years of neglect, was revived through immersion schools and university programs, children once again learning to speak the tongue of their ancestors. Chants, songs, and stories were recorded, preserved, and passed on, ensuring that memory would not be erased. The revival was not simply about art. It was about identity, about reconnecting to roots that had been severed by annexation, plantation life, and statehood. This movement also reignited debates over sovereignty. Many Hawaiians began to question what statehood had truly meant, whether it had been a choice freely made or an option forced by history. The memory of Queen Liliuokalani's overthrow lingered, her words and songs echoing as reminders of a stolen kingdom. Activists gathered at Iolani Palace, once the seat of Hawaiian royalty, demanding recognition of the injustice of annexation. Protests erupted over land use, from the building of resorts to the military's control of large swaths of territory. In the 1990s, the U.S. government issued a formal apology, acknowledging the overthrow of the monarchy as illegal. For many, it was too little, too late. For others, it was a step toward healing. But the question of sovereignty remains unresolved, debated passionately in classrooms, legislatures, and community gatherings. Should Hawaii be recognized as an independent nation once more? Should Native Hawaiians be granted rights similar to Native American tribes, with self-governance and cultural protection? Or is statehood irreversible, the only path forward? These questions continue to divide, but they also keep alive the spirit of a people who refuse to forget. Amid this struggle, Hawaii exists as both a global destination and a deeply indigenous place. Tourists fill the beaches of Waikik, snapping photographs beneath palm trees, while only miles away, elders teach children the proper way to chant before entering a heiau, an ancient temple. Luxury resorts line Maui's shores. While on the Big Island, families still farm taro in valleys much as their ancestors did centuries ago. Jets roar into Honolulu International Airport, unloading visitors from Tokyo, Los Angeles, and Sydney, while canoes glide across the ocean, guided by stars as Polynesian navigators once did. Their traditions preserved and revived by voyaging societies determined to keep knowledge alive. Hawaii is at once a spectacle and a sanctuary, a stage for the world and a home for its people. For native Hawaiians, the journey has been one of resilience. Their numbers were devastated by disease in the 19th century, their sovereignty stripped, their language nearly lost. Yet against these odds, they have endured. The revival of hula and language, the protests for land and rights, the growing awareness of history's injustices. These are not signs of defeat, but of survival. The spirit of Aloha, so often misused by outsiders, remains at the heart of this survival. It is not simply a greeting, not simply a slogan for tourists. It is the deep understanding of connection, of love, of respect, of living in harmony with land and people. For Hawaiians, aloha is not something to be sold. It is something to be lived. Today, Hawaii stands as a paradox. It is paradise and battleground, playground and homeland, state and nation in memory. Millions come each year to see its beauty, to rest on its beaches, to marvel at its volcanoes. They come seeking escape, and they find it. But beneath the surface, the islands remain alive with debates, struggles, and dreams. What does it mean to be Hawaiian? What does it mean to belong to a land that is both America's 50th state and a kingdom that once stood sovereign? What does it mean to protect paradise while sharing it with the world? These questions linger, as they have for generations, with no simple answers. The story of Hawaii today is not one of resolution, but of coexistence. Tourism thrives, even as activists fight to preserve sacred places. The American flag flies, even as some dream of the Hawaiian flag restored to sovereignty. Development continues, even as environmentalists work to save reefs and forests. Hula is performed for tourists at luau's, and also in ceremonies that tourists never see, where each movement honors gods and ancestors. The islands are layered, complex, filled with contradictions and truths. And yet, through it all, the people of Hawaii endure. They laugh, they sing, they gather for family luau's, they paddle canoes, they surf the waves, they chant the names of their ancestors, they raise children who speak Hawaiian once again. They live aloha in ways that cannot be packaged, in bonds of family, in care for the land, in resistance to forgetting. The Hawaii of today is not the Hawaii of postcards, nor is it simply the Hawaii of sorrow and loss. It is both and more, a living place, a proud people, a culture that survives against the odds. From volcanic fire to Polynesian voyagers, from Kamehameha's unification to Liliuokalani's fall, from Pearl Harbor's flames to the fireworks of statehood, Hawaii's journey has been long, turbulent, and extraordinary. Today, the story continues, written not only in history books, but in the lives of those who call the islands home. Hawaii is at once American and Hawaiian, modern and ancient, fragile and resilient. It is a place where the spirit of Aloha persists, not as a slogan, but as a way of being, carrying forward into an uncertain future the strength of a people and the beauty of their land. Epilogue: The Spirit of Aloha. The story of Hawaii is unlike any other in the American experience. It begins not with colonial settlers or founding fathers, but with fire and ocean, volcanic rock rising from the depths of the Pacific, shaped by gods and winds, made fertile by lava and rain. From this foundation came voyagers, guided by stars across thousands of miles of open sea, carrying with them plants, animals, and stories. They created a world that was both practical and sacred, sustained by taro fields, fish ponds, and the kapu system that bound life to divine order. Out of myth and mana, Hawaii became a kingdom, a chain of thriving societies ruled by alii, whose bloodlines linked them to the gods themselves. Then came Kamehameha the Great, the warrior who united the islands through conquest and vision, forging a kingdom recognized by the world. But the currents of history did not rest. Strangers arrived with iron, with muskets, with Bibles, with treaties. Missionaries spread literacy even as they condemned hula. Whalers filled the ports, planters filled the valleys with cane, and foreign powers filled the halls of government with pressure. Queens and kings tried to balance sovereignty with survival, some succeeding for a time, others watching their power eroded. The last monarch, Liliuokalani, stood with dignity as her crown was taken, yielding not out of weakness, but out of love for her people. The overthrow was followed by annexation, a decision made far away in Washington without the consent of those who called Hawaii home. The monarchy ended, and the islands became a territory, their destiny bound to a nation across the sea. Then came war. Pearl Harbor turned paradise into a battlefield, plunging Hawaii into the heart of global conflict. Martial law silenced its people, but their resilience endured. When victory came, the islands stood changed, modernized, militarized, and known across the world. The demand for equality grew louder, culminating in the vote of 1959, when Hawaii became the 50th star. Fireworks filled the sky, but beneath the celebration lingered the sorrow of those who mourn the kingdom's loss. Today, Hawaii is at once a global destination and an indigenous homeland. Its beaches welcome millions, while its mountains guard stories older than America itself. Tourists sip Mai Tais, while activists chant for sovereignty. Hotels rise beside fish ponds, jets roar over canoes guided by constellations. The contradictions are sharp, but they are real. Hawaii is not one thing. It is many things at once, American and Hawaiian, ancient and modern, fragile and enduring. What then does Hawaii teach us? It teaches us that identity is not erased, even under immense pressure. The Hawaiian people, decimated by disease, stripped of land, dethroned of their queen, still preserved their songs, their dances, their language. Even when hula was banned, it survived in secret, re-emerging in strength during the cultural revival. Even when the Hawaiian language was nearly silenced, it was reborn in schools, carried proudly by new generations. The resilience of Hawaii's people is a reminder that culture is not fragile. It is stubborn, enduring, able to bend without breaking. Hawaii also teaches us about belonging. For centuries, life on the islands was built on the principle of connection. Connection to land, to ancestors, to gods, to community. Aloha is not just a greeting or marketing word. It is a way of being. It speaks of compassion, of respect, of love that extends beyond the self to embrace others and the natural world. In a world often divided, Hawaii offers a vision of unity, not through conquest or assimilation, but through recognition that to belong is to give and to receive in balance. And Hawaii teaches us about the price of paradise. The islands are beautiful, but beauty has often made them vulnerable to exploitation, to colonization, to commercialization. The same turquoise waters and golden beaches that draw tourists also conceal histories of struggle, protests over land, and debates about sovereignty that remain unresolved. To know Hawaii truly is not only to see its postcard image, but to listen to its people, to hear the sorrow and pride interwoven in their stories. Paradise, Hawaii reminds us, is not a product to be bought. It is a relationship to be honored. For America, Hawaii has been both a gift and a challenge. It has given the nation its gateway to the Pacific, its naval stronghold, its beloved vacation land. But it has also forced America to confront its contradictions, the ideals of liberty and self-determination set against the reality of a monarchy overthrown without consent, a people annexed without a vote. Hawaii is the reminder that democracy has its blind spots, that even in the land of the free, not every people have been free to choose their destiny. The 50th star shines brightly, but it also carries shadows. For the world, Hawaii stands as a crossroads. It is the meeting point of East and West, North and South, a place where cultures mix, where languages mingle, where diversity is not exception, but norm. It shows how identities can coexist, how new traditions can be created without abandoning old ones. It shows how global pressures, military, economic, environmental, can weigh heavily on small places, and yet how those places can still radiate influence far beyond their size. The journey of Hawaii, from volcanic rock to modern state, is a story of resilience. It is a story of survival through myth, conquest, overthrow, annexation, war, and tourism. But it is also a story of pride. Pride in language, in song, in the red, yellow, and green of the Hawaiian flag, in the memory of kings and queens, in the chant of ancestors. That pride has never died, and it will not die. Because identity is not something that can be erased by treaties or votes. It is something carried in the hearts of people, passed on like the stars that once guided canoes across the Pacific. The spirit of Aloha endures. It endures in the smile of a grandmother, teaching her grandchild to chant. It endures in the hands of a farmer planting taro in muddy fields. It endures in the sound of drums at the Merry Monarch Festival, in the swaying of dancers who honor not tourists, but gods and ancestors. It endures in the protests at Mauna Kea, where Hawaiians gather not in defiance of science, but in defense of sacred land. It endures in every person who whispers the words of the language that once seemed lost, but now thrives again. Hawaii's story is not finished. It continues in the debates over sovereignty, in the fight for environmental protection, in the balance between welcoming the world and preserving identity. It continues in the resilience of its people, who carry forward both sorrow and joy. It continues in the tension between being American and being Hawaiian, between the 50th star and the First Kingdom. That tension is not a weakness. It is the very strength of Hawaii, the proof that identity can hold contradictions and still endure. From volcanic birth to modern statehood, Hawaii has shown the world that resilience is not the absence of struggle, but the persistence through it. It has shown that belonging is not about ownership, but about respect. It has shown that identity is not static, but alive, shifting, yet rooted. These lessons are not only for Hawaii, they are for all of us, wherever we live, whoever we are. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the islands glow with colors of fire and water, the same elements that gave them birth. The waves crash, the trade winds blow, and the people continue, living with memory, with pride, with aloha. Hawaii is not only a place, it is a story, a journey, a reminder. It teaches us that even when crowns are lost, even when lands are taken, even when cultures are suppressed, the spirit of a people can endure. And so the story closes, not with an ending, but with a lesson. From volcanic rock to ancient kingdom, from overthrow to statehood, Hawaii remains itself, resilient, proud, and alive. Its gift to America and to the world is the spirit of aloha, not a word to be sold, but a way of living. To carry aloha is to remember connection, compassion, and belonging. It is to remember Hawaii's unique journey and to honor it. It is to know that even in the face of fire, conquest, and loss, identity survives. Hawaii endures. Aloha endures. And so does the story.